Greetings, this is Mr. Nobody, the MAGA Republican, with another part of the series on January 6th. Let us hear some more. We left off having heard a few statements from the floors of Congress, the House of Representatives so far, to hear what they had to say about some of the evidences that were going on. Now we're going to hear some more.
A number of states that did not follow the constitutional requirement for selecting electors. Madam Speaker, this is something that is clear that our founding fathers debated about as a fundamental decision of how we choose our president. There was a lot of back and forth. If anyone reads the founding documents of our country about the different versions they went through to ultimately come up with a process where each state has elections, each state has a process for selecting their electors and sending them to Washington. And Madam Speaker, in a number of those states, that constitutional process was not followed. And that's why we're here to object. If you look at what the requirement says, nowhere in Article 2, Section 1 does it give the Secretary of State of a state that ability. Nowhere does it give the governor that ability. Nowhere does it give a court that ability. It exclusively gives that ability to the legislatures. And in fact, in most states, that's the process that was followed. But for those states that this wasn't followed, unfortunately, this is not new. We've seen over and over again more states where the Democrat Party has gone in and selectively gone around this process. That has to end, Madam Speaker. We have to follow the constitutional process. Now, there might be reasons why some people don't like the process laid out by a legislative body. Madam Speaker, I served on one of those legislative bodies when I was in the state legislature for 12 years. I served on the House and Governmental Affairs Committee where we wrote the laws for our state's elections. And I can tell you, when we had to make changes, those were extensively negotiated. We would have people on both sides come, Republicans and Democrats, Madam Speaker, would get together to work through those changes, any minute change, to how a precinct would function, to how a change would be made in the time of an election, signature requirements, all the many things that involve a clerk carrying out the duties in each parish, in our case. You would see people come and give testimony. Madam Speaker, both sides could come. Clerks of court were there in the hearing rooms. It was an open process, by the way, not behind closed doors in a smoke-filled room where somebody might want to bully a Secretary of State to get a different version that might benefit them or their party or their candidate. That's not what our founding fathers said is the process. Maybe it's how some people wanted to carry it out, but they laid out that process. And so when we would have to make those changes, they were in public view. They were heavily debated. And then ultimately, those laws were changed in advance of the election so everybody knew what the rules were. People on both sides knew how to play the rules before the game started, not getting somewhere in the process and saying, well, you don't think it's going to benefit you, so you try to go around the Constitution. That's not how our system works. It's gotten out of hand. And so President Trump has called this out. And President Trump has stood up to it. So many of us have stood up to it. And in fact, over 100 of my colleagues, Madam Speaker, asked the Supreme Court to address this problem just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, the court chose to punt. They didn't answer one way or the other. They didn't want to get in the middle of this discussion. We don't have that luxury today. We have to discuss this. We have to fix this. In fact, on our first full day of this Congress, many of us brought legislation onto the House floor to start fixing the problems with our elections, to restore integrity to the election process, which has been lost by so many millions of Americans. And we had a vote. Every single Republican voted to reform the process. Every single Democrat voted against it. They don't want to fix this problem. But the Constitution is our guide. And it's time we start following the Constitution. It's time we get back to what our founding fathers said is the process for selecting electors. That's the legislatures. In public view, not behind closed doors, not smoke-filled rooms, not bullying somebody that might give you a better ruling. Let's get back to rule of law and follow the Constitution, Madam Speaker. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Very powerful argument, don't you think? Now, the next one we have in two parts because, well, I'm going to go skip over that and do one more, and one more from Speaker McCarthy before the whole invasion happened. Right? It's a little out of sequence because we did another from him after. But let's take a look at what happened, what he had to say before. It's not as long.
That's right. This isn't the first side of the aisle that's ever debated this issue. I thought what Madam Speaker said back in 2005, this is democracy at its best, when they talked about a presidential election in Ohio. These are the moments that we should raise the issue about integrity and accountability and accuracy in our elections. But you know what we should do that makes a difference? Not just raise the issue, but work together to solve the problems.
Okay. I think a key point is that, you see, when the Democrats lost in 2000 and 2004, also 1988, and of course 2016, they raised all kinds of objections at exactly this point. And they were allowed to do that precisely because that particular meeting is exactly the last chance that any questions about the integrity of the election can be addressed. It has no other forum. I mean, it should have had courts. The courts refused to address it. They left it to Congress. It was Congress's job to address these things. By not addressing these things, the message our Congress ended up sending to the American people was that a successful cheat is as good as a legitimate win. All right, now let's get to one of the strongest characters I know of, Paul Gosar of Arizona, who was the representative who particularly raised the objection so they could do this. And Ted Cruz had served as the senator raising the objection. So now let's hear Gosar Part 1. He gets interrupted, and I can talk about that a bit too. Let's start with Gosar Part 1.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I filed my petition, a challenge of the slate of electors from the state of Arizona. It was actually put forward by Governor Ducey of Arizona. My ask to you, the Speaker, to the Vice President, is simple. Do not count these electors until and unless the Secretary of State allows a forensic audit of the election, a request she has denied repeatedly. We have been told over and over that even though this was a public election, using public money on public machines, utilizing public employees, the public today has no ability to simply double-check the veracity of these results. If the presidential election was a football game, we would get a slow-motion review from multiple angles and a correction of a controversial decision. But not so. We are told by our Secretary of State for the presidential election, no review for you. No access to the Dominion voting machines with a documented history of enabling fraud through its now discredited adjudication system, a system that literally allows one person to change tens of thousands of votes in a mere minutes. In the only audit done in Arizona, a court found 3% error rate against President Trump. Vice President Biden's margin of error was 1/10 of that, at 0.03%. By the way, a 3% error rate at minimum is 90,000 ballots. After finding the 3% error rate, the court stopped the audit and refused to go further. In Arizona, as my attachment makes clear, mail-in ballots will alter on the first day of counting, as shown in data graphs we have provided, and it's concluded by data analysts. Over 400,000 mail-in ballots were altered, switched from President Trump to Vice President Biden. or completely erased from President Trump's code. The proof is in the counting curves, the curves that cannot occur except with odds so rare and unlikely that winning the Mega Millions lottery is more probable. Mr. Speaker, can I have order in the chamber?
All right. Something was happening there. Something was happening right there. The invaders had come into the building. But after being a little bit worried about it for a while, the House decided they could resume and allow Representative Paul Gosar to finish his comments. So he finished those comments, and then they broke again. Reason being was that these people, when they came in, first place they went was the Senate chamber. That's the first direction they headed. Later on, they started wandering elsewhere and found their ways to the actual representative and so forth. But the brunt of them went straight for the Senate chamber. There's a reason for that, which I will get to. So, but after a while, Paul Gosar was able to continue his comments. And let's hear the rest of what he had to say.
Issues here. Over 30,000 illegal aliens voted in Arizona using the federal ballot. Yet our Secretary of State refused the public access to review the ballot. Over a thousand residences were visited for proof of residency and address. 456 failed that test. They were vacant lots. Even the recorder's office used as addresses. What are they hiding? If the process was fair, these would be improbable. These would be once-in-a-lifetime type applications. So look at the ballots, the signatures, and the adjudicated records. Until this is done, Mr. Speaker, we should not count this slate. You have a letter from the Arizona legislature stating its intent to review the issue on January 11th. Our governor has refused to allow the state to properly convene to do its proper oversight. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I ask you one question today. Are you a ceremonial figurehead in your current role? Or did the drafters of the 12th Amendment and Congress in the Electoral Count Act of 1887 envision a role where you made discretionary decisions about ballot fraud and fair elections? If you were merely ceremonial, then let's be done with this. Let's heat our tea and crumpets and witness our national decline. But if you're not merely a ceremonial but vested with discernment, rationality, and legal authority, do not just count from 1 to 270. Then do not accept Arizona's electors as certified. Remand the slate back to the Secretary of State, back to the governor with the following instructions. Until a full, complete electoral forensic audit is allowed by the Secretary of State, the electors currently certified will not be counted. It will then fall on the state of Arizona to decide, does its electors, are they in the game or not? Anything less is an abdication of our constitutional republic and our ethos. One man, one vote. We ask why. What is there behind? Should the lawful victor of an election be proud, open, transparent about an election audit? I would. Instead, we're met with denials, cover-ups, and contempt of subpoenas. There's too much evidence of fraud demonstrated by statistical anomalies that experts have determined cannot happen in the absence of fraud to accept such a slate. I'm not asking these electors never be counted. It's just that they need to be certified the proper way. Our beloved Constitution is but a mere piece of paper if we do not follow the law, upholding the law. But now, alas, we find ourselves lawless, destroying the very thread that binds us together. But we need to get back to the rule of law. That is what has been violated, truly, by the actions in these states. With that, I feel that. The gentleman's having issues.
So, he makes a lot of interesting points. You notice at some point he goes from Miss Speaker, because it normally would have been Nancy Pelosi, to Mr. Speaker, because Nancy had been escorted out of the room and somebody else filled in temporarily instead, a Jim McGovern, to be precise. So that's why he said Mr. Speaker. Now, there's a lot going on here. He's talking about some of the illegal aliens. We'll hear a little bit more. Being allowed to vote where they should not be able to vote. Only citizens are supposed to be able to vote. So we hear about that. but we also hear about the people of the ballots that trace not to a place where anybody lives, but to a P.O. box or even some official government office. So, I mean, these kinds of things, had to be gone through and examined before we can, know which slate of electors to go by. Because, as I said, Arizona did send 2 slates of electors. No matter how much people may deny it, they sent 2. They sent the initial one based on the moron counts, and then they realized we need to do a more detailed count, and we're going to send another slate of electors as well, and we're going to leave it to the state or to the Congress to decide which slate. So he's already saying the big thing. Is this just a formality? That's what some people are trying to argue. Is all this what we do here just a formality? If it is, then there's no recourse. And in that case, a successful cheat really is as good as a legitimate win. This is our only recourse left. After the courts has failed us, after the local state governments have failed us, after all the other evidences that have been seen and known and then now concealed, all these things have failed us. After efforts of the president to get these things looked at and so forth have all failed us, this meeting, this gathering was the one last forum where these sort of things can be addressed and hopefully something done about it. But at the very least, and what we saw happening was the bringing out of some of this evidence. Now, I'm going to switch forms a little bit here. The Senate had a couple of things, and I'm going to start with Ted Cruz, because while they split between the House and the Senate for 2 hours, Ted Cruz had a lot of very worthwhile things to say.
Mr. President, Senator, we gathered together at a moment of great division, at a moment of great passion. We have seen, and no doubt will continue to see, a great deal of moralizing from both sides of the aisle. But I would urge to both sides perhaps a bit less certitude and a bit more recognition that we are gathered at a time when democracy is in crisis. Recent polling shows that 39% of Americans believe the election that just occurred, quote, was rigged.
I'm going to insert a quick comment here. That's how many positively believed. There were larger numbers who had doubts, and even some on both sides of the aisle nationwide. But that's how many were convinced of it, just on the basis of the evidences alone, without having been tried or anything.
You may not agree with that assessment, but it is nonetheless a reality for nearly half the country. I would note it is not just Republicans who believe that. 31% of independents agree with that statement. 17% of Democrats believe the election was rigged. Even if you do not share that conviction, it is the responsibility, I believe, of this office to acknowledge that is a profound threat to this country and to the legitimacy of any administrations that will come in the future. I want to take a moment to speak to my Democratic colleagues. I understand. Your guy is winning right now. If Democrats vote as a bloc, Joe Biden will almost certainly be certified as the next president of the United States. I want to speak to the Republicans who are considering voting against these objections. I understand your concerns, but I urge you to pause and think. What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election. And I believe there's a better way. The leaders just spoke about setting aside the election. Let me be clear, I am not arguing for setting aside the result of this election. All of us are faced with two choices, both of which are lousy. One choice is vote against the objection. And tens of millions of Americans will see a vote against the objection as a statement that voter fraud doesn't matter, isn't real, and shouldn't be taken seriously. And a great many of us don't believe that. On the other hand, most, if not all of us, believe we should not set aside the results of an election just because our candidate may not have prevailed. And so I endeavored to look for door number 3, a third option, and for that I looked to history, to the precedent of the 1876 election, the Hayes-Tilden election, where this Congress appointed an electoral commission to examine claims of voter fraud. 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices examined the evidence and rendered a judgment. And what I would urge of this body is that we do the same. That we appoint an electoral commission to conduct a 10-day emergency audit, consider the evidence, and resolve the claims. For those on the Democratic aisle who say there is no evidence, they've been rejected, then you should rest in comfort. If that's the case, an electoral commission would reject those claims. But for those who respect the voters, simply telling the voters, go jump in a lake, the fact that you have deep concerns is of no moment to us, that jeopardizes, I believe, the legitimacy of this and subsequent elections. The Constitution gives to Congress the responsibility this day to count the votes. The framers knew what they were doing when they gave responsibilities to Congress. We have a responsibility. And I would urge that we follow the precedent of 1877. The Electoral Count Act explicitly allows objections such as this one for votes that were not regularly given. And let me be clear, this objection is for the state of Arizona, but it is broader than that. It is an objection for all 6 of the contested states to have a credible, objective, impartial body hear the evidence and make a conclusive determination. That would benefit both sides. That would improve legitimacy of this election. And so let me urge my colleagues, all of us take our responsibility seriously. I would urge my colleagues, don't take perhaps the easy path, but instead act together, astonish the viewers, and act in a bipartisan sense to say we will have a credible and fair tribunal, consider the claims, consider the facts, consider the evidence, and make a conclusive determination whether and to what extent this election complied with the Constitution and with federal law.
Now, that probably summarizes it about as good as one can hear. You see, I find the reactions, now I didn't show what any of the Democrats said, but a lot of them were just saying all these, oh, you're destroying democracy, you're overturning an election. Well, the election was already overturned with all the fraud. And instead of being allowed to put it right, we're just supposed to leave it overturned with Biden winning an election that he really didn't win, so far as we can legitimately tell. And again, these forensic audits, you saw Gosar call for it, and now you've seen Ted Cruz call for it. And that's a perfectly fair and reasonable thing. Investigate. Chase these things down. Do these detailed forensic audited recounts and see who really won these states. If we just throw out every ballot that wasn't cast by a living, legally registered citizen voter, casting that one as their one and only ballot, and every other ballot that doesn't meet those criteria, throw them out. And now count what you've got left and see what the actual will of the people is. But they weren't willing to do that. The Democrats don't even want to admit that that's what the Republicans were proposing. They want to make it sound like, oh, there's allegations, let's just put Trump in office. Nobody recommended that. Nobody. We all said, yes, these allegations are serious. There is considerable evidence behind these allegations. They need to be investigated. They need to be proven one way or another. You see, if the Democrats really believed that they had won, they should have been, sure, fine, knock yourselves out. Waste a few million of your money going for all these expensive recounts and just end up proving what we already know that we won. You know? They were afraid of that. No, we can't allow that. We can't allow that. No, you're going to kill the democracy if you attempt to ascertain the actual will of the people. We can't let you do that. We have to take what was there as if it's the will of the people. Plus a lot of Xerox machines and other things, and some dead people, and some illegal aliens. We'll hear more about that a little later on. I think it's going to be in the next segment. And that was it. That's the way somebody acts when they know, or at least strongly believe, that to know the truth is to realize your guy didn't win. You know? Would they act like that if they really thought, oh yeah, this election was clean, squeaky clean, absolutely perfect. You guys do whatever you want. All you're going to do is prove that our guy won. That's all you're going to do. Knock yourselves out. Have at it. Well, you notice not a one of them dared to say that. Because that's the one thing they dare not have happen. Again, two things would be found out. One is that Trump probably and almost certainly did in fact win. And second of all, how much an election can be tweaked, can be gamed. And that gets to actually the biggest issue. But I get ahead of myself here. Let's get one more comment from Congress, and then I think I'm going to have to call this quits for this installment. So this last one is how much of Jack Langford we could get to before the interruption happened.
You give 5 minutes to the senator from Oklahoma, Senator Langford. Senator from Oklahoma. President, in America, we settle our differences in elections. What happens if you don't trust the election count? You're concerned that so many courts denied or dismissed cases within hours after they were given thousands of pages of evidence. The reason we have a Congress to settle our nation's divisions and the rules of the Senate make sure that every opinion of the nation is heard is so issues like this can be addressed. The constitutional crisis in our country right now is that millions of Americans are being told to sit down and shut up. Their opinions matter. During the electoral challenge on January the 6th, 2005, Senator Ted Kennedy stood on the floor and said this. He said, I commend the many thousands of citizens in Massachusetts and other states who insisted on treating today's electoral vote count in Congress as a meaningless ritual would be an insult to our democracy unless we register our own protest against the obviously flawed voting process that took place in so many states. We are hopeful, he said, that this major issue that goes to the heart of our democracy is now firmly implanted on the agenda for effective action by Congress. End quote. I agree. The United States Constitution does not allow me to assign different electors to a state, nor should it. The United States Constitution does not give the option to the Vice President of the United States to just unilaterally decide which states are in and out, and it should not. Each state decides its electors through its people. A small group of senators, including myself, have demanded that we not ignore the questions that millions of people are asking in our nation. So we have proposed a constitutional solution. Pause the count. Get more facts to the states before January the 20th. We proposed a 15-member commission, just like what was done after the failed election of 1876. We're encouraging people to spend 10 days going through all the issues so states can have one last opportunity to address any challenges. Then the states as the Constitution directs, would make the final decision on their electors. I have some colleagues who have said that a 10-day commission is not enough time, so they have counter-proposed just ignoring the lingering questions. We need to do something. My challenge today is not about the good people of Arizona.
Yield up to 5 minutes to the senators from Oklahoma City Library.
Okay. That was the point at which the Senate was interrupted by the people inside. So it stops there. There's more, but I'll have to save that for another segment. Once again, he's proposing a very simple thing. He wants an investigative community consisting of 5 representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices to take 10 days to do nothing but review this evidence and make a decision about what to do, and so forth. And that's what they should do. And we can call for those recounts or anything else. In Arizona, Paul Gosar mentioned he tried to get that in his state, but he got blocked by other bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats in some cases, and prevented from doing what was a perfectly reasonable thing to be able to do, to go through and do some audits. And of course, he does mention the one audit where basically out of 100 ballots, 1 vote for Trump had been done away with, and 2 fake ones for Biden had been added, giving a 3-vote advantage for Biden out of that 100 ballots. And if you extend that to the whole thing, that's 3% or 90,000 votes that represents statistically. So there's a whole host of other statistical objections that have been brought forth. How is it that literally all of the bellwether states clearly were with Trump? And virtually all, I think maybe one lone exception of all the bellwether counties nationwide, which is like well over, maybe almost like a couple dozen or so, all but just one went clearly also with Trump. How about the fact also that Biden's supposed great popularity didn't have any coattails? I mean, if somebody's popular, people tend to support not only the person but their party, and then they end up voting. If you like Trump, you not only vote for Trump personally, but you vote Republicans into the other offices. If you really liked Biden, you'd be putting a lot of Democrats in these offices. Well, guess what? A lot of Democrats didn't get into that. And the House went from a clear majority of Democrats to just such a bare fraction that it was almost a break even. So, but there's more. But I'll be continuing that in the next section.